Welcome to Ship of the Week. This week we will cover one of the longest-lived passenger liners in history, the White Star Line workhorse, SS Germanic, of 1874. The second half of the 19th century was rapidly becoming a race of superlatives, as transatlantic steamship firms squabbled to best each other. White Star Line was pleased with the formula of speedy, moderately comfortable iron-hulled express liners established by the Oceanic-class ships of 1870, but the original 6 ships could not hope to compete with the ballooning scale of new Inman, Cunard, the Deutscher Lloyd, and Guion steamers. Intent on ensuring their services remained competitive, White Star ordered from Harland and Wolff in Belfast 2 sisters of similar descent to the Oceanics, but of a grander size. The hull numbers that would become Britannic and Germanic were nearly 470 feet long, 5,000 tons, and were capable of 16 knots under their twin compound steam engines built in South London. The ships also originally carried an auxiliary rig of sails for use in instances where powered propulsion was not possible. Germanic entered service in May of 1875, Liverpool to New York via Queenstown. In the following February, she snatched the eastbound speed record from City of Berlin, taking the record in the opposite direction a year later. Regularly scheduled service was occasionally punctuated by collisions, without much in the way of an obstruction to Germanic's progress, with the exception of an incident in 1885, in which a westbound crossing was forced to an early conclusion by a massive storm, the liner burying her nose in giant swells that caused considerable damage and flooding, and swept one of her crew members over the side into the sea. He was not recovered. The following, relatively uneventful decade saw countless immigrants arrive at Liberty's Copper Feet aboard Germanic, but by 1898 it was clear that the liner would need an extensive facelift to bring her up to the standards passengers at the turn of the century expected. She emerged a few months later with an additional deck, taller funnels to carry away the exhaust from her brand new triple expansion engines, the most modern passenger appointments Harland and Wolff could produce, and despite the lack of sails and spars, her tonnage registered a noticeable increase. Germanic also received a new commanding officer, a somewhat younger Edward Smith, who would go on in the early 1910s to command both of the Olympic-class liners that served their intended route. It was during this part of the ship's career that 2 additional mishaps took place. The first, in late 1895, resulted in the destruction of the coastal steamship Cumbre, although Germanic was able to take aboard the smaller vessel's beleaguered complement. And in the winter of 1899, she sank at the pier in New York, her stability compromised by several storms' worth of ice accumulation, an unfortunate delay to her next crossing, while her interiors were pumped clear. Still sound, she was made ready for a crossing home for several months of extraordinarily expensive interior repairs. By this point, the White Star Line was already under the control of J.P. Morgan's growing shipping empire, the International Mercantile Marine, and Germanic was transferred in 1904 for a season with the IMM subsidiary American Line. The following year, however, she transferred again, this time slightly more permanently, to the Dominion Line. She entered service in early 1905 to various Canadian cities under the name Ottawa. This route was maintained until Ottawa was withdrawn in 1909, and she left the Britain-North America service entirely. The Ottoman Empire, the state that had inherited Anatolia from Byzantium some half a millennium earlier, was by the turn of the 20th century a rapidly dwindling rump of a nation, still centered around Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Eastern Romans. The Ottoman Navy, by then primarily charged with clutching together the fraying threads of Ottoman imperial might, needed liners to carry troops and equipment to various theaters of open rebellion. Ottawa, renamed Gul Jamal, was placed in this purpose. She continued her transport role upon the Ottoman entry into the First World War, ferrying men to the Gallipoli campaign, and in May of 1915 was torpedoed by the British submarine E-14 while in this capacity. She was able to limp to safety. Gul Jamal participated in repatriation for the years immediately following the end of the war, and she returned to service to the United States under an Ottoman passenger firm, but the political instability the conflict left in its wake ended Ottoman sovereignty for good in 1920. Gul Jamal carried on ferrying passengers across the Atlantic, as well as Turkish forces during the new nation's war for independence. And on more than one occasion, the first president of the new Turkish Republic, Mustafa Ataturk, sailed aboard the liner. The ship was now well over half a century old, but was only withdrawn from passenger service in 1937. She was laid up for the duration of the Second World War, and eventually, with all other proposed ventures failing to materialize, the venerable old Atlantic liner departed in late 1950 for Italy, 3/4 of a century after she slid down the ways at Belfast.